Hey there! Tonight we're diving into the shadows of the Old West to uncover the story of one of its most ruthless villains. We're talking about Colm O'Driscoll, the cold-blooded gang leader whose rivalry with Dutch van der Linde shaped the fate of everyone caught between them. This is a story of ambition without conscience, violence without purpose, and what happens when a man chooses cruelty over everything else. If this helps you settle in for the night, feel free to like the video, but only if it brings you some peace. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from. It's good to know who else is out there winding down. Colm O'Driscoll stands as one of Red Dead Redemption 2's most significant antagonists. Not because he's the most powerful or the most present, but because he represents everything Dutch van der Linde claims to stand against, while actually mirroring Dutch's worst qualities. Understanding Colm means understanding the dark reflection of Dutch's gang, seeing what the van der Linde gang could become if they abandoned their principles entirely. Colm is a gang leader without philosophy, an outlaw without code, a man who uses people as tools and discards them without thought. His story is one of violence, betrayal, manipulation, and the kind of evil that comes not from passion or ideology, but from simple, calculating selfishness. The historical Colm O'Driscoll, or at least the version that exists in the Red Dead universe, was likely born in Ireland sometime in the 1840s or early 1850s, making him roughly the same age as Dutch van der Linde, or perhaps slightly older. The exact details of his early life are never fully revealed in the game, but we can infer certain things from context and from what characters say about him. Colm came to America during or after the Great Irish Famine, that devastating period from 1845 to 1852, when disease destroyed Ireland's potato crops and led to mass starvation and emigration. Over 1 million Irish people died, and another 1 million or more fled to America, often arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and trauma that would shape generations. Colm would have been among these immigrants, arriving in America as a young man or possibly even a child, carrying with him the hardness that comes from surviving genuine horror. The Irish immigrants who came during and after the famine faced tremendous discrimination in America. No Irish need apply signs were common. Irish workers were exploited and underpaid. Irish neighbourhoods were overcrowded slums, and Irish people were often viewed as less than human by the established American population. This environment of poverty, discrimination, and struggle created conditions where criminality became a survival strategy for many Irish immigrants. Gangs formed along ethnic lines, providing protection, community, and economic opportunities that legitimate society denied. Colm O'Driscoll built his gang in this context, likely starting in the 1870s or early 1880s as a young man looking to carve out power and wealth in a country that offered him few legitimate paths to either. The O'Driscoll gang became one of the most notorious outlaw groups in the American West, known for their brutality, their lack of discrimination in choosing targets, and their willingness to do anything for money. Unlike Dutch's gang, which at least claimed to rob from the rich and avoid unnecessary civilian casualties, the O'Driscolls had no such pretensions. They robbed anyone, killed anyone who got in their way, and built their reputation on fear rather than any romantic outlaw mystique. The relationship between Colm O'Driscoll and Dutch van der Linde is central to understanding both men and the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. At some point in the past, probably in the 1880s, Colm and Dutch were actually partners, or at least allies. The exact nature of their relationship is never fully detailed, but various characters reference a time when the two gangs worked together or when Colm and Dutch were friends. This makes sense given their similarities. Both were charismatic, Irish-descended outlaws building gangs based on loyalty and shared purpose. Both were intelligent and capable leaders. Both operated in similar territories and targeted similar scores. But something went catastrophically wrong between them, and that something was betrayal and death. The exact sequence of events is somewhat unclear from the game's various references, but the core facts are these. At some point, Colm O'Driscoll killed Dutch's lover, a woman named Annabelle. In retaliation, Dutch killed Colm's brother. These mutual killings created a blood feud that lasted for over 15 years by the time of Red Dead Redemption 2's events in 1899. The feud wasn't just about these specific deaths, though those were the catalyst. It became about pride, about revenge, about two men who were too similar to coexist, and who each saw the other as a threat to their authority and reputation. The question of who betrayed whom first is interesting and never definitively answered. Dutch and his gang members always present Colm as the betrayer, the one who broke whatever alliance or friendship existed by killing Annabelle. But we only ever hear Dutch's side of this story, and given what we learn about Dutch's character throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, his version of events should be taken with skepticism. It's entirely possible that Dutch betrayed Colm first, or that the situation was more complicated than Dutch's narrative allows. What we do know is that Colm killed Annabelle, Dutch killed Colm's brother, and the two men have been trying to destroy each other ever since. The death of Annabelle clearly affected Dutch profoundly, shaping his relationships with women afterward, and feeding his hatred of Colm. Dutch never takes another serious romantic partner after Annabelle, instead having brief affairs with women like Molly O'Shea, who he keeps at emotional distance. The loss seems to have hardened something in Dutch, or perhaps it gave him justification for hardness that was always there. Dutch uses Annabelle's death as moral justification for his hatred of Colm, presenting himself as the wronged party seeking righteous vengeance. But Dutch's response, killing Colm's brother, shows that Dutch is capable of the same kind of personal, vicious violence that he condemns in Colm. Colm's response to his brother's death is harder to read because we never see Colm express genuine emotion about anything. Unlike Dutch, who at least performs grief and attachment, Colm seems genuinely cold, treating even his brother's death as just another move in a long game. This doesn't mean Colm didn't care about his brother, but if he did, he channels that grief into calculation rather than passion. Colm's approach to the feud is notably different from Dutch's. Where Dutch makes it personal and emotional, talking about honour and betrayal and revenge, Colm treats it as business, looking for opportunities to use the feud to his advantage rather than letting it consume him. By 1899, the O'Driscoll gang is large, well established, and active across multiple states. They have hideouts in New Hanover, particularly in the Heartlands region, and they operate throughout the territories where the Van der Linde gang also works. The O'Driscolls are numerous enough to be a genuine threat, with dozens of members who can be mobilised for large operations. The gang structure seems less tight-knit than Dutch's, more of a loose confederation of criminals who follow Colm because he's successful and dangerous, rather than because of any ideological commitment or family feeling. O'Driscoll gang members are expendable to Colm in ways that Van der Linde gang members aren't supposed to be to Dutch, though as Red Dead Redemption 2 progresses, Dutch starts treating his people more like Colm always has. The O'Driscolls' criminal activities are diverse and indiscriminate. They rob trains, stagecoaches, homesteads, and travellers. They rustle cattle, run protection rackets, engage in kidnapping for ransom, and work as hired guns for anyone who'll pay. They're known for violence and for leaving witnesses dead, building a reputation that makes people terrified to resist them. This approach is effective in the short term, generating income and preventing testimony, but it also makes them priority targets for law enforcement. The O'Driscolls face constant pressure from lawmen and bounty hunters, losing members regularly to arrests and shootouts. Colm's response is simply to recruit more men, treating gang members as replaceable resources rather than valued individuals. The first significant encounter between the O'Driscolls and the Van der Linde gang in Red Dead Redemption 2 happens early in the game, shortly after the gang escapes the mountains and establishes camp at Horseshoe Overlook. The Van der Linde gang is trying to rob a train, and they discover that the O'Driscolls are planning to rob the same train. This isn't coincidence. Both gangs are operating in the same territory and targeting the same opportunities, which means conflict is inevitable. The encounter establishes the ongoing nature of the feud and shows that both gangs are willing to kill each other on sight. There's no negotiation, no attempt at coexistence, just immediate violence when they cross paths. Shortly after this, the O'Driscolls ambush Arthur Morgan and a group of Van der Linde gang members, wounding John Marston and killing or capturing several O'Driscolls in the resulting shootout. These early encounters establish the pattern that will continue throughout the game. The two gangs are in a state of constant low-level warfare, with skirmishes and ambushes happening regularly as they compete for territory and opportunities. Neither side can afford to ignore the other, but neither can commit to a full-scale war that would draw too much law enforcement attention. So they exist in this state of ongoing hostility, bleeding each other slowly while trying to avoid mutual destruction. Colm O'Driscoll himself doesn't appear in person until later in the game, during one of the most significant and disturbing sequences in Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch receives word that Colm wants to meet to discuss a truce, to end the feud that's been costing both gangs men and opportunities. Dutch is sceptical but intrigued, and he agrees to a meeting in a neutral location with both leaders bringing minimal backup. Arthur is suspicious of the whole arrangement, recognizing that Colm has never shown any interest in peace before, and questioning why he would suddenly want to negotiate. But Dutch, perhaps driven by ego or by genuine hope that the feud can end, decides to go through with the meeting. The meeting is, of course, a trap, but not the kind of trap Arthur or Dutch anticipate. Colm doesn't plan to kill Dutch at the meeting. That would be too simple and wouldn't serve Colm's purposes. Instead, Colm plans something more elaborate and cruel. The meeting takes place in a clearing, with Dutch and Arthur positioned on a ridge overlooking the site, while Colm approaches with his own men. Dutch and Colm talk, with Colm proposing peace, and Dutch responding with suspicion and hostility. The conversation goes nowhere, with both men trading accusations and insults rather than making genuine progress toward any agreement. Then Colm and his men leave, and Dutch thinks the meeting was pointless but harmless. But Arthur, who was providing sniper cover for Dutch during the meeting, has been captured by O'Driscolls who snuck up behind him while he was focused on protecting Dutch. This was Colm's plan all along. Not to kill Dutch, but to capture Arthur, Dutch's most trusted lieutenant and enforcer. Arthur is taken to an O'Driscoll hideout where he's held prisoner, and this is where we see Colm O'Driscoll's true nature most clearly. Colm visits Arthur in captivity, and their conversation reveals Colm's plan and his character in ways that are chilling. Colm explains to Arthur that he doesn't particularly care about Arthur personally. Arthur is just a tool, a means to an end. Colm's plan is to hold Arthur prisoner and let Dutch know where he is, then wait for Dutch to attempt to rescue. When Dutch comes for Arthur, Colm will have the law waiting. Having tipped off the authorities about Dutch's location, Dutch will be captured or killed, and Colm will receive the substantial reward money that's on Dutch's head, while also eliminating his rival. It's a clever plan that uses Arthur as bait and exploits Dutch's loyalty to his gang members. Colm is counting on Dutch caring enough about Arthur to risk a rescue, and he's willing to bet Arthur's life on that assumption. What makes this plan particularly cruel is that Colm doesn't really need to keep Arthur alive for it to work. Arthur is tortured by the O'Driscolls, beaten and starved, kept in terrible conditions. Colm could have treated Arthur better to ensure he'd be convincing bait, but Colm allows or encourages the abuse because he simply doesn't care about Arthur's suffering one way or another. Arthur is an object to Colm, not a person, and whether Arthur lives or dies after serving his purpose is irrelevant. This casual cruelty, this complete lack of empathy or consideration for others' humanity, is what defines Colm O'Driscoll as a villain. The conversation between Colm and Arthur also reveals Colm's view of Dutch and the Van der Linde gang. Colm sees Dutch as a hypocrite and a fool, someone who pretends to have principles, but is really just as selfish and violent as any other outlaw. Colm mocks Dutch's philosophizing and his claims about loyalty and family, suggesting that Dutch will abandon Arthur if the risk of rescue is too high. Colm is essentially arguing that he and Dutch are the same, that Dutch's pretensions of being better or more moral are just pretensions, and that when it comes down to it, Dutch will choose self-preservation over loyalty just like Colm would. This is where Colm's plan reveals something important about the difference between him and Dutch, or at least the difference Dutch wants to believe exists. Colm assumes Dutch will come for Arthur because Dutch's ego won't allow him to be seen as someone who abandons his people, not because Dutch actually cares about Arthur. Colm is projecting his own psychology onto Dutch, assuming that Dutch's motivations are as cynical and self-serving as Colm's own. And while Colm isn't entirely wrong about Dutch, especially about the Dutch we see later in the game, he's wrong enough that his plan doesn't work as intended. Arthur, showing the toughness and resourcefulness that make him Dutch's best enforcer, manages to escape from the O'Driscoll hideout before Dutch attempts any rescue. Arthur is badly wounded, having been shot and beaten, and he barely makes it back to camp. When he arrives, he discovers that Dutch never came for him, that Dutch either didn't know Arthur was captured or didn't prioritize rescuing him. This is a significant moment in Arthur's growing disillusionment with Dutch, one of the early cracks in Arthur's faith that will eventually break completely. Dutch's explanation for not rescuing Arthur is weak and defensive, suggesting that Dutch either fell for Colm's misdirection or that Dutch made a calculated decision that rescuing Arthur wasn't worth the risk. The question of whether Dutch knew Arthur was captured and chose not to rescue him, or whether Dutch genuinely didn't realise Arthur was in danger, is never definitively answered. Dutch claims he thought Arthur had simply left the meeting site to scout or pursue O'Driscolls, that he didn't realise Arthur was captured until much later. But Dutch's explanation feels like rationalisation, and Arthur clearly has doubts about whether Dutch is telling the truth. This ambiguity is important because it shows how Colm's plan, even though it failed to capture Dutch, succeeded in damaging the trust between Dutch and Arthur. Colm planted seeds of doubt that will grow throughout the rest of the game. Colm O'Driscoll's plan also reveals his understanding of psychology and manipulation. He correctly identifies that the relationship between Dutch and Arthur is central to the Van der Linde gang's cohesion, and he tries to exploit that relationship to destroy both men. Even though the plan doesn't work as intended, it shows that Colm is intelligent and strategic, not just a brute. He thinks several moves ahead, he understands his enemy's psychology, and he's willing to be patient and elaborate in pursuing his goals. These qualities make Colm dangerous in ways that go beyond just his willingness to use violence. After Arthur's escape, the conflict between the O'Driscolls and the Van der Linde gang intensifies. The Van der Linde gang raids O'Driscoll hideouts, killing dozens of O'Driscoll gang members in retaliation for Arthur's capture and torture. These raids are brutal and thorough, showing the Van der Linde gang at their most violent and coordinated. Arthur, John, and other gang members attack O'Driscoll camps at Hanging Dog Ranch and other locations, wiping out everyone they find. The violence is personal and angry, driven by revenge rather than profit. Dutch encourages this violence, using the conflict with the O'Driscolls to unite his gang and give them a common enemy at a time when internal tensions are starting to show. Colm's response to these raids is notably pragmatic. He doesn't escalate to all-out war, doesn't commit his full forces to destroying the Van der Linde gang. Instead, he continues operating as he always has, recruiting new members to replace those killed, pursuing profitable opportunities, and treating the conflict with Dutch as just one aspect of his business, rather than an all-consuming vendetta. This restraint isn't mercy or fear, it's calculation. Colm recognizes that an all-out war would be costly and would draw law enforcement attention that would hurt both gangs. He's willing to bleed Dutch slowly rather than risk mutual destruction in a decisive confrontation. This difference in approach reflects the fundamental difference between Colm and Dutch. Dutch makes everything personal and emotional. He needs to believe his actions have meaning and purpose beyond just survival and profit. Colm is purely transactional. He does what serves his interests without needing to justify it with philosophy or emotion. Dutch's approach inspires loyalty and creates genuine bonds between gang members, but it also makes Dutch vulnerable to emotional manipulation and poor decision-making when his ego's involved. Colm's approach is more stable and rational, but it means his gang lacks cohesion, and his men have no real loyalty to him beyond fear and profit. The O'Driscolls continue to be a presence throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, appearing as random encounters and enemies in various missions. They ambush the player, they rob and kill NPCs, they control territory that the player must fight through. These encounters reinforce the O'Driscolls as a constant threat and show the scope of their operations. The O'Driscolls aren't just a few dozen men, they're a large criminal organisation with resources and reach that match or exceed the Van der Linde gangs. This makes Colm a significant power in the region's criminal underworld, someone who's built and maintained a successful criminal enterprise for decades. The final confrontation between Colm O'Driscoll and the Van der Linde gang comes not through direct combat but through the law. Colm is eventually captured by the authorities, arrested for his many crimes and scheduled for public execution in St. Denis. This capture represents a significant victory for law enforcement and a major blow to the O'Driscoll gang. Without Colm's leadership, the gang will likely fragment and collapse, with various lieutenants either trying to take control or simply going their own ways. The capture also represents an opportunity for Dutch, a chance to finally end the feud by ensuring Colm dies. When Dutch learns of Colm's capture and scheduled execution, he becomes obsessed with attending the hanging. This obsession reveals something important about Dutch's psychology and his relationship with Colm. Dutch needs to see Colm die, needs to witness his enemy's defeat personally. This isn't about justice or closure, it's about ego and vindication. Dutch wants to be there when Colm hangs so he can feel that he won their decades-long conflict. The fact that Dutch didn't actually capture Colm, that the law did what Dutch couldn't, doesn't seem to bother Dutch. What matters is that Colm will die and Dutch will survive, and Dutch can interpret that as victory. Sadie Adler, who has her own reasons for hating the O'Driscolls after they killed her husband and destroyed her life, is equally determined to see Colm hang. Sadie's hatred is more pure than Dutch's, driven by genuine grief and trauma rather than ego. The O'Driscolls murdered her husband in front of her, assaulted her, and left her with nothing. Watching Colm die won't bring her husband back or heal her trauma, but it represents a form of justice and closure that she desperately needs. Sadie's desire to attend the execution is understandable and sympathetic in ways that Dutch's isn't. Maybe defiance, maybe resignation, maybe even a kind of grim satisfaction that he's taking Dutch's obsession with him to the grave. Colm doesn't beg or plead or show weakness beyond the fear that any person would feel in his situation. He faces his death with a kind of dignity that's surprising, given everything we know about his cruelty and cowardice. Perhaps Colm recognizes that how he dies is the last thing he can control, the last statement he can make, and he chooses to die without giving Dutch the satisfaction of seeing him break. Dutch watches Colm with intense focus, and his expression is complex. There's satisfaction there, the vindication he came for, but there's also something darker, an obsessive quality that suggests Dutch needs this more than is healthy. Dutch has built so much of his identity around his conflict with Colm, has used Colm as justification for so many of his actions and decisions, that Colm's death should feel like liberation. But instead it feels like Dutch is losing something, losing the enemy who gave his violence meaning and purpose. Without Colm to hate and fight against, Dutch will need to find new justifications for his actions, new enemies to blame for his failures. The execution proceeds, and Colm O'Driscoll is hanged. His death is quick, the drop breaking his neck cleanly rather than leaving him to strangle slowly. The crowd reacts with a mixture of cheers and uncomfortable silence, the spectacle of public execution being both entertainment and horror. Colm's body hangs there, lifeless, and the feud that defined both his and Dutch's lives for over 15 years is finally over. Colm O'Driscoll, one of the West's most notorious outlaws, is dead, executed by the law he spent his life defying. But the execution isn't the end of the disaster for the Van der Linde gang. Sadie, overcome with emotion, and perhaps disappointed that Colm's death doesn't bring the closure she hoped for, causes a scene that draws attention to their group. Law enforcement recognizes Dutch, and suddenly the gang members are running for their lives through St. Denis with lawmen in pursuit. The escape is chaotic and violent, with shootouts in the streets and desperate flight through alleys and buildings. They eventually escape, but the incident brings even more heat on the gang and contributes to the mounting pressure that will eventually destroy them. The irony of Colm's death is that it accomplishes nothing positive for Dutch or the Van der Linde gang. Colm is dead, but the gang's problems continue and actually worsen. The O'Driscoll gang fragments without Colm's leadership. But that doesn't help the Van der Linde gang, who are dealing with their own internal collapse. Dutch's obsession with witnessing Colm's execution leads directly to increased law enforcement attention and contributes to the gang's eventual destruction. In trying to claim victory over Colm, Dutch actually hands Colm a kind of posthumous victory, as Dutch's obsession with the feud contributes to his downfall. Colm O'Driscoll's legacy is one of violence and cruelty without purpose or meaning. Unlike Dutch, who at least tried to pretend his actions served some higher purpose, Colm was honest about what he was, a criminal who hurt people for profit and power. In some ways, this honesty makes Colm less hypocritical than Dutch, even if it doesn't make him less evil. Colm never pretended to be anything other than what he was, never asked his men to believe in a philosophy or vision beyond survival and profit. His gang members knew what they were signing up for, knew that Colm would sacrifice them without hesitation if it served his interests. The O'Driscoll gang's fate after Colm's death is never fully detailed in the game, but we can infer that it collapsed relatively quickly. Without Colm's leadership and reputation, the gang would have no cohesion. Various lieutenants might have tried to take control, leading to internal conflict and fragmentation. Some O'Driscoll gang members probably joined other gangs or went solo, while others were arrested or killed by law enforcement or rivals. Within a few years, the O'Driscoll gang as an organisation probably ceased to exist, remembered only as one of many outlaw gangs that rose and fell during the dying days of the Old West. Colm's relationship with his gang members is worth examining because it contrasts so sharply with Dutch's relationship with his gang. Dutch, for all his flaws and manipulation, genuinely seems to care about his gang members on some level. He knows their names, their stories, their strengths and weaknesses. He invests time in building relationships and loyalty, creating a sense of family and shared purpose. Dutch's gang members are loyal to him not just because of fear or profit, but because of genuine emotional bonds and belief in Dutch's vision. This loyalty is what keeps the gang together even as Dutch's judgment deteriorates and his decisions become increasingly destructive. Colm, by contrast, treats his gang members as interchangeable resources. He doesn't seem to know or care about them as individuals beyond their usefulness. O'Driscoll gang members are loyal to Colm because he's successful and dangerous, because following him is profitable and leaving him is risky. But there's no emotional bond, no sense of family or shared purpose beyond survival and profit. This means O'Driscoll gang members have no reason to stay loyal when things get difficult, no reason to sacrifice for each other or for Colm. The O'Driscoll gang is held together by fear and profit rather than genuine loyalty, which makes it more fragile despite its size. This difference in leadership style reflects the different paths Colm and Dutch took from similar starting points. Both were Irish or Irish-descended outlaws who built gangs in the American West during the same era. Both were intelligent and charismatic enough to attract followers and maintain criminal enterprises for decades. But Dutch chose to build his gang around ideology and loyalty, creating genuine bonds even if those bonds were based partly on manipulation. Colm chose pure pragmatism, building his gang around profit and fear without bothering with the emotional labour of creating loyalty. Dutch's approach created a more cohesive and effective gang, but it also made Dutch vulnerable to emotional manipulation and poor decision-making. Colm's approach was more stable and rational, but it meant his gang lacked the cohesion to survive his death. The question of whether Colm O'Driscoll was always the cruel, calculating villain we see in Red Dead Redemption 2 or whether he became that way through experience and trauma, is interesting to consider. We know Colm came from Ireland during or after the famine, that he experienced poverty and discrimination, that he lost his brother to Dutch's revenge. These experiences could have hardened him, could have taught him that caring about people makes you vulnerable and that survival requires ruthlessness. Or perhaps Colm was always this way, always someone who saw people as tools and who lacked empathy or conscience. The game doesn't provide enough information about Colm's past to answer this definitively, which is probably intentional. Colm remains somewhat mysterious, defined more by his actions and their effects on others than by his internal psychology. What we do know is that Colm O'Driscoll represents a particular type of villain, the pragmatic monster, who does evil not because of ideology or passion, but because it serves his interests. Colm doesn't hate the people he hurts, doesn't take pleasure in their suffering beyond the profit it brings him. He's not sadistic in the way that some villains are, taking joy in cruelty for its own sake. Instead, Colm is coldly indifferent to others' suffering, willing to cause any amount of pain if it serves his purposes, but not particularly interested in causing pain that doesn't benefit him. This makes him more realistic and in some ways more disturbing than villains who are driven by passion or madness. The contrast between Colm and Micah Bell, another major antagonist in Red Dead Redemption 2, is instructive. Micah is cruel because he enjoys cruelty, because hurting people makes him feel powerful and superior. Micah's evil is personal and emotional, driven by his own insecurities and need for dominance. Colm's evil is impersonal and transactional, driven by calculation rather than emotion. Micah is more immediately hateable because his cruelty is so personal and petty. But Colm is arguably more dangerous because his actions are more rational and strategic. Micah makes mistakes because his ego and emotions cloud his judgment, while Colm's judgment remains clear because he doesn't let emotion interfere with calculation. The feud between Colm and Dutch also serves as a dark mirror, showing what Dutch could become if he abandoned his principles entirely. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, we watch Dutch gradually become more like Colm, more willing to sacrifice his people for his own interests, more focused on ego and revenge than on the gang's welfare, more ruthless and less principled. The difference between Dutch and Colm at the start of the game is significant, but by the end that difference has narrowed considerably. Dutch never becomes quite as cold and calculating as Colm. Dutch's actions are still driven by emotion and ego rather than pure pragmatism, but the trajectory is clear. Dutch is becoming the thing he hates, becoming the villain he's defined himself against. This transformation is part of what makes Red Dead Redemption 2's story so tragic. The conflict with Colm and the O'Driscoll should be a clear case of good versus evil, or at least better versus worse. The Van der Linde gang, for all their crimes, at least tries to have principles and loyalty. The O'Driscolls are indiscriminate killers without redeeming qualities, but as the story progresses, the moral distinction between the two gangs becomes less clear. The Van der Linde gang commits atrocities, betrays innocence, and tears itself apart through internal conflict. By the end, it's hard to argue that the Van der Linde gang is meaningfully better than the O'Driscolls. They've just been better at pretending to be better. Colm's plan to use Arthur as bait to capture Dutch is particularly significant because it shows Colm understanding something about Dutch that Dutch doesn't fully understand about himself. Colm recognises that Dutch's ego and his need to be seen as loyal to his people are vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Colm correctly predicts that Dutch will attempt to rescue, not because Dutch genuinely cares about Arthur, but because Dutch can't afford to be seen as someone who abandons his people. What Colm gets wrong is the extent to which Dutch actually does care about Arthur, or at least cared at that point in the story. Dutch's failure to rescue Arthur isn't because Dutch doesn't care. It's because Dutch is confused, conflicted, and starting to prioritise his own survival over his people's welfare. The ambiguity about whether Dutch knew Arthur was captured and chose not to rescue him, or whether Dutch genuinely didn't realise Arthur was in danger, is crucial to understanding Dutch's character arc. If Dutch knew and chose not to rescue Arthur, it shows Dutch is already far gone, already willing to sacrifice his most loyal lieutenant to avoid risk. If Dutch genuinely didn't realise Arthur was captured, it shows Dutch is becoming dangerously disconnected from his gang, so focused on his own concerns that he's not paying attention to his people's welfare. Either interpretation is damning, and the game deliberately leaves it ambiguous so players can decide for themselves how far Dutch has fallen at this point in the story. Arthur's torture at the hands of the O'Driscolls is one of the game's most brutal sequences, showing the O'Driscolls at their worst and establishing them as genuinely threatening villains, rather than just generic enemies. Arthur is beaten, starved, and left in terrible conditions, and the game doesn't shy away from showing the physical and psychological toll this takes. When Arthur escapes, he's visibly damaged, moved slowly and painfully, and the experience clearly affects him. This isn't just a minor setback that Arthur shrugs off, it's a genuine trauma that has lasting effects on Arthur's view of Dutch, of the gang's situation, and of his own mortality. The torture sequence also establishes the O'Driscolls as more than just obstacles or targets. They're people capable of genuine cruelty and evil. The O'Driscoll gang members who torture Arthur aren't just following orders, they seem to enjoy it, taking pleasure in Arthur's suffering. This makes them hateable in ways that make the later missions where Arthur and the gang wipe out O'Driscoll camps feel justified and satisfying. The game is careful to establish the O'Driscolls as deserving targets, as people who've done terrible things and who represent genuine threats, so that the violence against them doesn't feel excessive or unjustified. Colm's death by hanging is significant because it represents the law finally catching up to one of the West's most notorious outlaws. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, there's a tension between the outlaws and the encroaching forces of law and civilization. The outlaws are losing slowly but inevitably as law enforcement becomes more organized and effective, as civilization spreads and the frontier disappears. Colm's capture and execution represent a victory for this process, showing that even the most successful and dangerous outlaws can't escape forever. The law is patient and persistent, and eventually it catches everyone. The public nature of Colm's execution is also significant. Public executions were common in the 19th century, serving as both entertainment and moral instruction. The authorities wanted people to see outlaws hang, to witness the consequences of criminality, and to be deterred from following similar paths. Colm's execution draws a large crowd, people who want to see the notorious outlaw get what he deserves. There's something disturbing about this, about the spectacle of death as entertainment, but it was a normal part of 19th century American culture. The game captures this disturbing normalcy, showing the crowd's mixture of excitement and discomfort as they watch a man die. Dutch's need to witness Colm's execution reveals the extent to which Dutch has defined himself through his conflict with Colm. For over 15 years, Dutch has had Colm as an enemy, as someone to hate and fight against, as justification for violence, and as explanation for setbacks. Colm's death should be liberating for Dutch, should allow him to move on and focus on other concerns. But instead, it seems to leave Dutch somewhat lost, deprived of the enemy who gave his actions meaning. This suggests that Dutch needs enemies, needs conflict and opposition to define himself against. Without Colm, Dutch will need to find new enemies, and increasingly those enemies will be within his own gang, or will be abstractions like civilization, or the law that can't be defeated through violence. Sadie's reaction to Colm's execution is more straightforward, but no less tragic. Sadie wants Colm to die because the O'Driscolls destroyed her life, and she hopes his death will bring closure or justice, or some sense that her husband's murder has been avenged. But watching Colm hang doesn't bring the peace Sadie hoped for. Her husband is still dead, her old life is still gone, and Colm's death doesn't change any of that. Sadie's realization that revenge doesn't heal trauma, that justice doesn't undo harm, is painful and realistic. The game doesn't offer easy answers or cathartic resolution. It shows that some wounds don't heal, and some losses can't be avenged in any meaningful way. The chaos that follows Colm's execution, with Sadie causing a scene, and the gang being recognised and chased through St. Denis, shows how the gang's obsession with Colm continues to hurt them even after Colm is dead. They came to St. Denis for closure, for the satisfaction of seeing their enemy die, and instead they brought more trouble on themselves. This is a pattern throughout Red Dead Redemption 2. The gang's emotional decisions, their need for revenge and vindication, consistently lead to disasters that pragmatic decisions might have avoided. If Dutch had stayed away from the execution, if he'd let Colm die without needing to witness it, the gang would have been better off. But Dutch can't let go, can't resist the emotional pull of seeing his enemy defeated, and that weakness costs the gang dearly. The O'Driscoll gang's role in Red Dead Redemption 2 extends beyond just being antagonist for the Van der Linde gang. They represent a particular type of outlaw organisation, one that's purely criminal without pretensions of being anything else. Where Dutch's gang at least claims to rob from the rich and help the poor, to have principles and loyalty, the O'Driscolls make no such claims. They're honest about what they are. Criminals who hurt people for money. This honesty is almost refreshing in its way, even if it doesn't make them less evil. The O'Driscolls don't ask anyone to believe in a philosophy or vision. They don't manipulate people with talk of loyalty and family. They offer a simple transaction. Follow Colm, make money, accept the risks that come with outlaw life. This transactional approach to gang membership has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that it's honest and straightforward. People know what they're getting into and what's expected of them. There's no emotional manipulation, no pretense of family or higher purpose. The disadvantage is that it creates no real loyalty, no reason for gang members to sacrifice for each other, or for Colm beyond immediate self-interest. When things get difficult, when law enforcement pressure increases, or when opportunities dry up, O'Driscoll gang members have no reason to stay. They can leave or betray Colm without feeling like they're abandoning family or betraying principles, because there was never any family feeling or principles to begin with. The Van der Linde gang's approach, by contrast, creates genuine loyalty and cohesion, but at the cost of emotional manipulation and the pain that comes when that loyalty is betrayed. Van der Linde gang members believe they're part of something meaningful, that their crimes serve a higher purpose, that they're family rather than just colleagues. This belief makes them willing to sacrifice and take risks that purely mercenary criminals wouldn't accept, but it also makes them vulnerable to manipulation and makes betrayal more painful when it inevitably comes. When Dutch starts sacrificing his people or making decisions that contradict his stated principles, it hurts more because the gang members believed in something beyond just profit and survival. The question of which approach is better, Colm's honest pragmatism or Dutch's manipulative idealism, doesn't have a clear answer. Both approaches have costs and benefits, both lead to violence and suffering, both ultimately fail as the West is civilized and outlaws are hunted down. Perhaps the real lesson is that there's no good way to be an outlaw, no approach that avoids the inevitable consequences of living outside the law. Both Colm and Dutch end up dead or destroyed, their gangs scattered or killed, their life's work amounting to nothing but pain and loss. The method doesn't matter when the destination is the same. Colm O'Driscoll's Irish heritage is worth examining because it provides context for his character and his place in American society. Irish immigrants in the late 19th century faced significant discrimination and hardship, often pushed into poverty and criminality by lack of legitimate opportunities. Irish gangs were common in American cities and on the frontier, providing community and economic opportunity for people who were excluded from mainstream society. Colm's gang would have been one of many Irish criminal organisations operating in America during this period, part of a broader pattern of immigrant communities creating parallel power structures when legitimate society rejected them. The Irish experience in America was complicated, marked by both victimization and participation in victimizing others. Irish immigrants were discriminated against and exploited, but Irish Americans also participated in discrimination against other groups, particularly Black Americans and later immigrants. Irish gangs like Colm's would have been both victims of an unjust system and perpetrators of violence and exploitation against others. This complexity is hinted at in Red Dead Redemption 2 but not fully explored, as the game focuses more on individual characters than on broader social and historical context. Colm's relationship with his brother, whose death at Dutch's hands helped fuel the feud, is never fully detailed in the game. We don't know the brother's name, his role in the gang, or the exact circumstances of his death. This absence is notable because it makes Colm's motivations somewhat opaque. Did Colm genuinely love his brother and seek revenge for personal reasons? Or was the brother's death more about the insult and the challenge to Colm's authority? The game leaves this ambiguous, which makes Colm harder to read and understand. We can't fully sympathise with Colm because we don't know if his grief is genuine, or if he's just using his brother's death as justification for actions he would have taken anyway. This ambiguity is consistent with how the game presents Colm throughout. He's never given a sympathetic moment, never shown to have genuine emotions or attachments beyond his hatred of Dutch. Even his fear at his execution is presented as natural self-preservation rather than as a humanizing moment. The game wants players to see Colm as a villain, as someone who represents the worst of outlaw culture without any of the romantic or sympathetic qualities that Dutch's gang sometimes displays. Colm is what outlaws actually are when you strip away the mythology and romance. Violent criminals who hurt people for profit. The O'Driscoll gang's criminal activities are shown throughout the game in various encounters and missions. They rob homesteads, killing families and taking everything of value. They ambush travellers, leaving no witnesses. They rustle cattle and horses, destroying the livelihoods of ranchers and farmers. They work as hired guns for corrupt businessmen and politicians, doing violence for whoever will pay. These activities establish the O'Driscolls as indiscriminate predators who target anyone vulnerable, regardless of whether their victims are rich or poor, guilty or innocent. This indiscriminate violence is what separates the O'Driscolls from the Van der Linde gang in the game's moral framework, even though the Van der Linde gang also commits terrible acts. The game's treatment of the O'Driscolls as acceptable targets for violence is worth examining critically. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, players kill hundreds of O'Driscoll gang members, often in missions that involve raiding their camps and wiping them out to the last man. This violence is presented as justified and even heroic, as the player is eliminating dangerous criminals who've done terrible things. But it's also worth noting that many of these O'Driscoll gang members are probably just desperate men trying to survive in a harsh world. People who joined the gang for the same reasons people joined Dutch's gang. Lack of alternatives, need for community and protection, desire for a better life than legitimate society offered them. The game doesn't really engage with this moral complexity when it comes to the O'Driscolls. They're presented as acceptable targets, as people whose deaths don't require moral justification beyond the fact that they're O'Driscolls. This is somewhat understandable from a gameplay perspective. The game needs enemies for players to fight, and making those enemies too sympathetic would create uncomfortable moral questions that would interfere with the fun of the gameplay. But it's also a simplification that contrasts with the game's more nuanced treatment of the Van der Linde gang and their victims. The O'Driscolls are dehumanized in ways that make violence against them feel acceptable, which is ironic given that the game is partly about the dehumanization that allows violence. Colm's capture by the law is never shown in the game. We only learn about it after the fact when Dutch hears that Colm is scheduled for execution. This absence is interesting because it means we never see Colm defeated or vulnerable until his execution. We don't know how he was captured, whether he fought or surrendered, whether he was betrayed by his own men or simply caught by competent law enforcement. This maintains Colm's mystique to some extent, keeping him as a figure of reputation and rumour rather than showing him in defeat. When we finally see Colm at his execution, he's already condemned, already defeated, and all that remains is the formality of his death. The law enforcement that captures Colm is never identified specifically, but it was probably either the Pinkertons or federal marshals, as local sheriffs wouldn't have had the resources or authority to take down someone as notorious and well protected as Colm O'Driscoll. The Pinkertons are shown throughout Red Dead Redemption 2 as the primary law enforcement threat to major outlaws, and they're effective and ruthless in pursuing their targets. Colm's capture by professional law enforcement rather than by Dutch or the Van der Linde gang is significant because it shows that the real threat to outlaws isn't other outlaws, it's the organised forces of law and civilization that are systematically eliminating the outlaw way of life. Colm's execution in St. Denis is appropriate symbolically because St. Denis represents modernity and civilization in Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a city with electric lights, streetcars, industry, and organised law enforcement. It's the future that's replacing the frontier, the world where outlaws like Colm and Dutch can't survive. Having Colm executed in St. Denis rather than in some frontier town emphasises that the old ways are dying, that the West is being civilized, and that people like Colm are being eliminated by the forces of progress and order. Whether this is presented as good or bad is ambiguous. The game shows both the costs of outlaw violence and the costs of civilization's advance. The crowd at Colm's execution includes people from all walks of life, rich and poor, respectable citizens and criminals, people who've been victimized by outlaws and people who romanticize outlaw life. This diversity reflects the complicated relationship American society had with outlaws in the late 19th century. Outlaws were both feared and admired, seen as both threats to order and as symbols of freedom and resistance to authority. Public executions of notorious outlaws were major events that drew crowds because they represented the triumph of law over lawlessness, but also because they were the end of stories that people had followed with fascination. Colm's execution is entertainment, spectacle, moral instruction, and historical moment all at once. Dutch's expression as he watches Colm die is one of the game's most revealing character moments. Dutch should be triumphant, should be satisfied that his enemy is finally dead, but instead he looks almost lost, almost sad, as if Colm's death is taking something from Dutch rather than giving him what he wanted. This suggests that Dutch's identity has been so wrapped up in his conflict with Colm that Colm's death leaves Dutch without a crucial part of his self-definition. Dutch has spent 15 years hating Colm, using Colm as justification for his actions and as explanation for his failures. Without Colm, Dutch will need to find new justifications and new explanations, and increasingly those will be internal to his own gang rather than external enemies. The fact that Colm's death doesn't bring Dutch peace or closure is tragic and realistic. Revenge rarely brings the satisfaction people expect, and the death of an enemy doesn't undo the harm they caused or heal the wounds they inflicted. Dutch wanted Colm dead, but Colm's death doesn't bring Annabelle back, doesn't erase the years of conflict and loss, doesn't solve any of Dutch's actual problems. If anything, Colm's death makes Dutch's situation worse by depriving him of a useful enemy and by leading to the chaos that follows the execution. Dutch would have been better off staying away, letting Colm die without witnessing it, but Dutch's need for vindication and closure overrides his judgment. Sadie's emotional breakdown at the execution, which leads to the gang being recognised and chased, reflects her own struggle with trauma and revenge. Sadie has channeled her grief over her husband's death into violence and revenge, becoming a skilled gunfighter and a valuable member of the gang. But violence and revenge haven't healed her trauma, haven't brought her peace or closure. Watching Colm die should be satisfying, should feel like justice for her husband's murder, but instead it just reminds her that her husband is still dead, and that no amount of revenge will change that. Sadie's realization that revenge is empty is painful and realistic, showing that the cycle of violence doesn't lead anywhere good. The escape from St. Denis after the execution is chaotic and violent, with the gang fighting their way through streets full of lawmen and civilians. This sequence shows the gang at their most desperate and dangerous, willing to kill anyone who gets in their way to avoid capture. The violence is excessive and indiscriminate, showing that the Vanderlind gang, when cornered, is just as ruthless and dangerous as the O'Driscolls they claim to be better than. This moral equivalence is part of the game's broader theme about the nature of violence and the thin line between heroes and villains, between justified and unjustified killing. The aftermath of Colm's execution sees the O'Driscoll gang largely disappear from the game's narrative. There are still some O'Driscoll encounters in the open world, but they're no longer a major plot element. This reflects the reality that without Colm's leadership, the gang has lost cohesion and purpose. The O'Driscolls were held together by Colm's reputation and success, and without him, there's no reason for the gang to stay unified. Various O'Driscoll lieutenants probably tried to take control, leading to internal conflict and fragmentation. Some members probably joined other gangs, some went solo, some were arrested or killed. Within a relatively short time, the O'Driscoll gang as an organisation ceased to exist. This fragmentation contrasts with the Van der Linde gang's trajectory. The Van der Linde gang also falls apart, but it takes longer and is more painful because the bonds between members are stronger. Dutch's gang doesn't just fragment when Dutch is captured or killed, it tears itself apart through internal conflict and betrayal, while Dutch is still alive and leading. The emotional bonds that made the Van der Linde gang strong also make its collapse more traumatic and destructive. The O'Driscolls simply scatter when Colm dies, but the Van der Linde gang destroys itself from within, with former friends and family members turning on each other. Colm O'Driscoll's role in Red Dead Redemption 2 is ultimately as a catalyst and a mirror. He's a catalyst for conflict that drives parts of the plot, and that gives the Van der Linde gang external enemies to fight. He's a mirror that shows what Dutch could become if he abandoned his principles entirely, showing the logical endpoint of Dutch's trajectory. Colm is what Dutch would be if Dutch stopped pretending to have ideals and just embraced being a criminal without justification or philosophy. The fact that Dutch is moving toward becoming more like Colm throughout the game is one of the story's central tragedies. The comparison between Colm and Dutch also raises questions about whether Dutch's philosophy and principles ever meant anything, or whether they were always just justifications for actions Dutch would have taken anyway. Dutch claims to rob from the rich and help the poor, to have loyalty and principles, to be building towards something better. But Dutch's actions increasingly contradict these claims, and by the end of the game, it's hard to see meaningful difference between Dutch and Colm, beyond Dutch's need to justify his actions with philosophy. Perhaps Dutch's principles were always just ego and self-justification, ways of feeling superior to criminals like Colm, while doing essentially the same things. Or perhaps Dutch genuinely believed in his principles at some point, but gradually abandoned them under pressure and through moral compromise. This interpretation is more charitable to Dutch, and suggests that he's a tragic figure who lost his way rather than a hypocrite who never had principles to begin with. The game supports both interpretations, leaving it ambiguous whether Dutch fell from grace or whether there was never any grace to fall from. Colm serves as a reference point for this question, representing what Dutch becomes or what Dutch always was beneath philosophical pretensions. The feud between Colm and Dutch also serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of revenge and the futility of violence. The feud started with betrayal and death, Colm killing Annabelle, and Dutch killing Colm's brother. These initial acts of violence led to 15 years of ongoing conflict, with both gangs losing members and opportunities because of their mutual hatred. Neither gang benefited from the feud. Both would have been better off if they'd found a way to coexist or if they'd simply avoided each other. But pride and revenge made coexistence impossible, and the feud continued until Colm's death, costing both gangs dearly. The futility of this violence is emphasised by the fact that Colm's death doesn't benefit Dutch, or the Van der Linde gang in any meaningful way. The gang's problems continue and worsen after Colm dies, and Dutch's obsession with witnessing the execution actually makes things worse by drawing law enforcement attention. If Dutch had simply let Colm die without needing to be there, the gang would have been better off. But Dutch couldn't let go of his need for vindication and closure, and that emotional weakness cost the gang dearly. The feud with Colm, which Dutch probably saw as justified and necessary, was actually just a distraction and a drain on resources that contributed to the gang's eventual destruction. Colm's intelligence and strategic thinking are demonstrated throughout his appearances in the game. His plan to use Arthur as bait to capture Dutch is clever and well thought out, showing that Colm understands psychology and is willing to be patient and elaborate in pursuing his goals. His decision not to escalate to all-out war with Dutch's gang shows strategic restraint and recognition that mutual destruction wouldn't serve his interests. His ability to maintain a large criminal organization for decades shows organizational and leadership skills that shouldn't be underestimated. Colm is not just a brute or a thug. He's an intelligent and capable leader who's built and maintained a successful criminal enterprise in a dangerous and competitive environment. This intelligence makes Colm more dangerous and more interesting as a villain. He's not someone who can be easily outsmarted or manipulated. He's playing the same game Dutch is playing, and he's arguably better at it, because he's not handicapped by ego or emotional attachments. Colm makes decisions based on calculation rather than emotion, which means his decisions are generally more rational and effective than Dutch's increasingly erratic choices. If Colm has a weakness, it's probably overconfidence and underestimation of variables he can't control, like Arthur's ability to escape captivity or the law's eventual success in capturing him. The O'Driscoll gang's size and reach are impressive and show that Colm was successful in building a criminal empire. The gang operates across multiple states, has numerous hideouts and safe houses, and can mobilize dozens of men for large operations. This level of organization and resources suggests that Colm was very good at what he did, that he was an effective leader and manager who could coordinate complex criminal operations across large territories. The O'Driscolls weren't just a small band of outlaws, they were a significant criminal organization that posed a genuine threat to law enforcement and to rival gangs. This success makes Colm's eventual capture and execution more significant. The law didn't just catch some small-time outlaw, they took down the leader of one of the West's most notorious and successful criminal organizations. Colm's execution represents a major victory for law enforcement and a demonstration that even the most successful and well-protected outlaws can be caught and punished. This would have been a significant news story, covered in newspapers across the country, used as an example of the law's triumph over lawlessness. Colm's death marks the end of an era, the elimination of one of the last major outlaw leaders from the dying days of the Old West. The O'Driscoll gang's recruitment practices are never detailed explicitly, but we can infer that they recruited widely and without much discrimination. The gang needed constant new members to replace those lost to law enforcement, rival gangs, and the general dangers of outlaw life. This meant taking anyone who was willing and capable, without much concern for their character or background. This approach created a large gang, but one without much cohesion or loyalty, as members had no particular reason to stay beyond immediate self-interest. The constant turnover also meant that the gang lacked the institutional knowledge and experience that comes from stable membership. The Van der Linde gang, by contrast, was more selective in recruitment, taking in people who Dutch thought could be moulded into loyal gang members who shared his vision. As the game wants Colm to serve as a villain and a foil to Dutch rather than as a fully developed character in his own right. Colm exists in the story primarily to create conflict and to serve as a dark mirror for Dutch, and giving him too much depth or sympathy might interfere with that narrative function. However, this one-dimensionality is also a limitation. Colm never feels as real or as complex as characters like Dutch, Arthur, or even secondary characters like Hosea or John. He's more of a plot device than a person, serving narrative functions rather than existing as a fully realized individual. This is a common issue with villains in video games and other media. They're often less developed than protagonists because their primary purpose is to create conflict rather than to be interesting in their own right. Colm suffers from this to some extent, though he's still more interesting than many video game villains because of his intelligence and his role as Dutch's dark mirror. The question of what Colm wanted beyond survival and profit is never really answered. Did he have long-term goals or ambitions? Did he want to retire eventually, to build something lasting, to be remembered for anything beyond his crimes? Or was he simply living day to day, taking opportunities as they came without thinking much about the future? The game doesn't provide answers to these questions, leaving Colm's motivations and goals somewhat opaque. This makes him harder to understand and predict, which serves the narrative by making him a more mysterious and threatening villain, but it also makes him less relatable and less interesting as a character. Dutch, by contrast, clearly has goals and ambitions beyond just survival. He wants to build a community, to live free from civilization's rules, to be remembered as someone who stood against injustice and oppression. These goals are probably delusional and self-serving, but they give Dutch depth and make him interesting to watch, even as he becomes increasingly villainous. Colm lacks this kind of depth. He's just a criminal doing crime, and while that makes him effective and dangerous, it doesn't make him particularly compelling beyond his role in the plot. The O'Driscoll gang's legacy after Colm's death is one of violence and fear without any redeeming qualities or positive impact. The gang hurt countless people, destroyed lives and communities, and contributed nothing positive to the world. When the gang fragmented after Colm's death, nobody mourned its passing except perhaps the gang members who lost their source of income and community. The O'Driscolls are remembered, if they're remembered at all, as one of many outlaw gangs that plagued the West during its final lawless years, as examples of the violence and chaos that civilization eventually eliminated. This contrasts with the Van der Linde gang's legacy, which is more complicated. The Van der Linde gang also hurt people and committed terrible crimes, but at least some gang members tried to do good or to help people. Arthur's redemption arc, John's eventual attempt at legitimate life, the gang's occasional acts of kindness or mercy. These complicate the gang's legacy in ways that the O'Driscoll's purely negative impact doesn't. The Van der Linde gang can be remembered as tragic figures who tried and failed to be better, while the O'Driscolls are just villains who got what they deserved. Colm's death scene, brief as it is one of the game's most powerful moments because of what it represents. This is the end of a man who built a criminal empire, who survived decades of outlaw life, who was one of the most feared and notorious criminals in the West, and he dies on a gallows in front of a crowd, executed by the law he spent his life defying, reduced to a spectacle for public entertainment. There's something both satisfying and disturbing about this. Satisfying because Colm was a villain who deserved punishment. Disturbing because of the spectacle and the crowd's enjoyment of watching a man die. The game doesn't moralise about Colm's execution, or tell players how to feel about it. Some players probably feel satisfaction at seeing a villain get what he deserves, while others might feel uncomfortable with the spectacle of public execution, regardless of the condemned person's crimes. This ambiguity is characteristic of Red Dead Redemption 2's approach to moral questions. The game presents situations and lets players draw their own conclusions, rather than providing clear moral judgments. Colm's execution is presented as both justice and spectacle, both the law's triumph and a disturbing display of state violence. The impact of Colm's death on Dutch is profound and lasting, even if Dutch doesn't fully recognise or acknowledge it. Dutch has defined himself partly through his opposition to Colm, has used Colm as justification for violence and as explanation for setbacks. With Colm dead, Dutch loses this convenient enemy and explanation. Dutch will need to find new enemies and new justifications, and increasingly those will be internal to his own gang or will be abstractions that can't be defeated. This contributes to Dutch's increasing paranoia and erratic behaviour in the later parts of the game, as he struggles to maintain his self-image and his authority without the external enemy who helped define his role. Sadie's arc after Colm's execution shows her gradually coming to terms with the fact that revenge doesn't heal trauma. Sadie continues to be violent and to seek out dangerous situations, but there's a growing awareness that this isn't bringing her peace or helping her move on from her husband's death. Colm's execution was supposed to be closure, the end of her revenge quest, but instead it just showed her that revenge is empty and that her husband is still gone. This realization doesn't stop Sadie from being violent, but it does seem to make her more aware of what she's doing and why, more conscious that she's choosing violence rather than being driven to it by grief. The O'Driscoll gang's role in the broader narrative of Red Dead Redemption 2 is to provide external conflict and to serve as a dark mirror for the Van der Linde gang. The O'Driscolls show what outlaws are when you strip away the romance and the justifications. They're violent criminals who hurt people for profit. The Van der Linde gang wants to believe they're different, that they're better, that their crimes serve some higher purpose. But the game gradually reveals that the difference between the two gangs is smaller than the Van der Linde gang wants to believe, that both gangs are ultimately just criminals causing harm regardless of their stated principles or justifications. This moral equivalence is uncomfortable and probably intentional. The game wants players to question whether the Van der Linde gang's crimes are really more justified than the O'Driscoll's crimes, whether Dutch's philosophy makes any meaningful difference in the harm caused, whether there's really such a thing as good outlaw or a justified robbery. By presenting the O'Driscolls as straightforward villains and then showing the Van der Linde gang doing similar things, the game forces players to confront the reality that the protagonists are also criminals who hurt innocent people, regardless of their stated principles or their occasional acts of kindness. Colm O'Driscoll's story is ultimately a tragedy, though not in the sympathetic sense. Colm's tragedy is that he spent his life building a criminal empire that meant nothing and left no positive legacy. He survived decades of outlaw life only to be captured and executed, dying on a gallows as public entertainment. His gang fragmented after his death, his life's work amounting to nothing but violence and suffering. He had intelligence and capability that could have been used for better purposes, but he chose to use those qualities for crime and cruelty. His death was probably a relief to many people who'd been victimized by his gang, and few, if any, mourned his passing. The contrast between Colm's death and Arthur's death is instructive. Both men die as a result of their outlaw lives, both face their deaths with a kind of dignity, both leave behind complicated legacies. But Arthur's death, at least in the High Honour playthrough, has meaning and purpose. Arthur dies ensuring that John and his family escape, dies having achieved some measure of redemption for his violent life, dies as a better man than he lived as. Colm's death has no such meaning or redemption. He dies as he lived, as a criminal who hurt people for profit, and his death changes nothing except removing one more outlaw from a world that's eliminating outlaws anyway. The question of whether Colm could have been redeemed, whether he could have become a better person if circumstances had been different, is interesting to consider. The game suggests that redemption is possible even for people who've done terrible things, as shown by Arthur's arc. But redemption requires recognition of wrongdoing, genuine desire to change, and actions that demonstrate that change. Colm shows no sign of any of these things. He never expresses regret for his actions, never shows empathy for his victims, never tries to be anything other than what he is. Whether this is because Colm is incapable of change or because he simply chooses not to change is unclear, but the result is the same. Colm dies unredeemed, having never tried to be better. This raises the question of whether some people are beyond redemption, whether some have done too much harm or are too set in their ways to change. The game doesn't provide a clear answer, but Colm's story suggests that redemption requires at minimum a desire to change and recognition of wrongdoing. Without those prerequisites, redemption isn't possible regardless of circumstances or opportunities. Colm never shows any desire to be better or any recognition that his actions are wrong, so he never has the opportunity for redemption that Arthur finds in his final months. The historical context of Colm's story, the dying days of the Old West and the transition from frontier to civilization, is important for understanding his character and his fate. Colm represents a way of life that's ending, a type of person who can't survive in the modern world that's emerging. The West is being civilized, law enforcement is becoming more organized and effective. Technology is making it harder for outlaws to hide and escape. Colm's capture and execution represent the inevitable triumph of civilization over the frontier, of law over lawlessness. Whether this is presented as progress or loss is ambiguous. The game shows both the costs of outlaw violence and the costs of civilization's advance. Colm's Irish heritage connects him to a broader pattern of immigrant criminality in 19th century America. Irish gangs were common in American cities and on the frontier, formed partly as protection and community for people who faced discrimination and exclusion from mainstream society. These gangs provided economic opportunities, social connections and protection that legitimate society denied to Irish immigrants. But they also perpetuated cycles of violence and criminality, trapping people in outlaw lives that often ended in prison or death. Colm's story is part of this broader pattern, showing both how discrimination and hardship can push people toward crime, and how crime ultimately destroys those who practice it. The game's treatment of Irish characters and Irish heritage is generally respectful and nuanced, showing Irish immigrants as complex people facing real hardships, while also showing that hardship doesn't excuse cruelty or violence. Colm is Irish, but his Irishness doesn't excuse or explain his actions. He's a villain because of his choices, not because of his heritage or background. Other Irish characters in the game, like Sean Maguire, show that being Irish and being an outlaw doesn't necessarily mean being cruel or evil. Sean is likeable and sympathetic despite being a criminal. showing that heritage and circumstances don't determine character. The relationship between Colm and his gang members is transactional and cold, lacking the emotional bonds that characterise Dutch's gang. O'Driscoll gang members follow Colm because he's successful and dangerous, because following him is profitable and leaving him is risky. But there's no sense of family or loyalty beyond immediate self-interest. This is shown in how easily the gang fragments after Colm's death, with members scattering or fighting among themselves rather than trying to maintain the organisation. Without Colm's leadership and reputation holding them together, the O'Driscolls have no reason to stay unified. This transactional approach to leadership has advantages in that it's honest and doesn't require the emotional labour of building genuine relationships. Colm doesn't need to care about his gang members or invest time in building loyalty. He just needs to be successful and dangerous enough that following him makes sense. But the disadvantage is that this creates no real loyalty or cohesion, meaning the gang is fragile and dependent entirely on Colm's continued success and presence. When Colm is captured and executed, the gang collapses because there's nothing holding it together beyond Colm himself. Dutch's approach, by contrast, creates genuine bonds and loyalty that survive even Dutch's increasingly erratic and destructive behaviour. Van der Linde gang members stay loyal to Dutch long past the point where rational self-interest would dictate leaving, because they genuinely care about Dutch and about each other. This loyalty is both the gang's strength and its weakness, making it more cohesive and effective, but also making its eventual collapse more painful and destructive. The emotional bonds that make the gang strong also make betrayal and conflict more damaging when they inevitably occur. The O'Driscoll gang's hideouts and camps are scattered throughout the game world, showing the scope of their operations. These locations are typically fortified and well defended, showing that the O'Driscolls are organised and prepared for conflict. The camps also show the gang's lifestyle, rough and violent, with little comfort or stability. O'Driscoll camps are places of business rather than homes, lacking the personal touches and sense of community that characterise the Van der Linde gang's camps. This reflects the different nature of the two gangs. The Van der Linde gang is trying to be a family and a community, while the O'Driscolls are just a criminal organisation. The player's raids on O'Driscoll camps are some of the game's most violent sequences, with Arthur and other gang members killing dozens of O'Driscolls in brutal assaults. These raids are presented as justified revenge for the O'Driscolls' crimes and for Arthur's torture, but they're also excessive and indiscriminate, killing everyone in the camps regardless of their individual guilt or role in the gang. This violence shows the Van der Linde gang at their most ruthless, and raises questions about whether their actions are really more justified than the O'Driscolls' crimes. The game doesn't provide clear answers, leaving players to decide for themselves whether the violence is justified or excessive. Colm's plan to use Arthur as bait shows his understanding of Dutch's psychology, and his willingness to be patient and elaborate in pursuing his goals. The plan requires Colm to capture Arthur without killing him, to hold him prisoner while waiting for Dutch to attempt a rescue, and to coordinate with law enforcement to set up an ambush. This is a complex operation that requires planning, patience and coordination, showing that Colm is capable of sophisticated strategic thinking. The plan's failure is due to Arthur's resourcefulness in escaping rather than any flaw in Colm's planning, suggesting that Colm's strategy was sound even if the execution didn't work out. The torture Arthur endures at the hands of the O'Driscolls is brutal and disturbing, showing the gang at their worst. Arthur is beaten, starved, and left in terrible conditions, and the O'Driscolls seem to take pleasure in his suffering beyond what's necessary to keep him prisoner. This cruelty establishes the O'Driscolls as genuinely evil rather than just criminals, as people who enjoy causing pain rather than just being willing to cause pain when it serves their interests. This makes the later violence against the O'Driscolls feel more justified, as the game has established them as deserving targets who've done terrible things. However, it's worth noting that the Van der Linde gang also tortures people when it serves their purposes. Arthur participates in torture during debt collection missions, and other gang members use violence and intimidation to extract information or compliance. The difference between the Van der Linde gang's torture and the O'Driscolls' torture is presented as one of necessity versus enjoyment. The Van der Linde gang tortures when they feel they have to, while the O'Driscolls seem to enjoy it. But this distinction is somewhat arbitrary and self-serving. Torture is torture regardless of the torturer's emotional state or justifications. Arthur's escape from O'Driscoll captivity is one of the game's most tense and memorable sequences. Arthur is badly wounded and weakened by torture, but he manages to overpower a guard, steal a gun, and fight his way out of the O'Driscoll hideout. The escape shows Arthur's toughness and resourcefulness, his ability to survive and fight even when badly injured and outnumbered. It also shows Arthur's determination to get back to the gang and warn them about Colm's plan, demonstrating Arthur's loyalty even as he's starting to question Dutch's leadership. The escape sequence is also significant because it's one of the few times in the game where Arthur is truly alone and vulnerable, without backup or support from the gang. Arthur has to rely entirely on his own skills and determination to survive, and his success shows that he's capable of functioning independently, even though he spent his adult life as part of the gang. This independence becomes important later in the game as Arthur increasingly makes decisions based on his own judgment, rather than blind loyalty to Dutch. Dutch's failure to rescue Arthur, whether due to genuine confusion about Arthur's situation or due to calculated decision. That rescue was too risky is a turning point in Arthur's relationship with Dutch. Arthur has always been loyal to Dutch, has always trusted that Dutch would protect him and the other gang members. Dutch's failure to come for Arthur, regardless of the reason, plants seeds of doubt that will grow throughout the rest of the game. Arthur starts questioning whether Dutch really cares about his people, or whether Dutch's talk of loyalty and family is just manipulation to keep people following him. This doubt is reinforced by Dutch's defensive and unconvincing explanation when Arthur returns to camp. Dutch claims he didn't realise Arthur was captured, that he thought Arthur had left the meeting site for other reasons. But Dutch's explanation feels like rationalisation, and Arthur clearly doesn't fully believe it. The incident creates a crack in Arthur's faith in Dutch, a crack that will widen as Dutch makes increasingly questionable decisions, and as Arthur's illness forces him to confront questions about loyalty, morality, and what really matters. Colm's death represents the end of an era in multiple ways. It's the end of the feud between Colm and Dutch that shaped both men's lives for over 15 years. It's the end of the O'Driscoll gang as a significant criminal organisation. It's a demonstration of the law's increasing effectiveness in hunting down and eliminating major outlaws. And it's a symbol of the West's transition from frontier to civilization, from a place where outlaws could thrive to a place where law and order prevail. Colm's execution is both a personal story about one man's death and a historical moment representing broader social changes. The fact that Colm's death doesn't bring closure or satisfaction to Dutch or Sadie shows the futility of revenge and the emptiness of violence as a solution to problems. Both Dutch and Sadie wanted Colm dead, believed his death would bring them peace or justice or vindication. But Colm's death changes nothing meaningful. Their problems continue, their pain remains, and they're left feeling empty rather than satisfied. This is a recurring theme in Red Dead Redemption 2, that violence doesn't solve problems and revenge doesn't heal wounds, that the cycle of violence just perpetuates itself without leading anywhere good. The O'Driscoll gang's crimes throughout the game are numerous and varied, showing them as indiscriminate predators who target anyone vulnerable. They rob homesteads, killing families and taking everything of value. They ambush travellers on roads, leaving no witnesses. They rustle cattle and horses, destroying ranchers' livelihoods. They work as hired guns for corrupt businessmen and politicians. They kidnap people for ransom. They run protection rackets in towns. This variety of criminal activity shows the O'Driscolls as opportunistic and adaptable, willing to do whatever is profitable regardless of the harm caused. This indiscriminate approach to crime is what separates the O'Driscolls from the Van der Linde gang in the game's moral framework. The Van der Linde gang, at least in theory, tries to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties and focuses on robbing from the rich rather than the poor. The O'Driscolls make no such distinctions. They rob and kill whoever is vulnerable regardless of wealth or innocence. This makes the O'Driscolls easier to hate and makes violence against them feel more justified, as they're presented as predators who victimize innocent people without discrimination or mercy. However, it's worth noting that the Van der Linde gang's actual behaviour doesn't always match their stated principles. The gang robs poor people, kills innocent civilians, and causes harm to vulnerable people throughout the game. The difference between the two gangs is more about rhetoric and self-image than about actual behaviour. The Van der Linde gang wants to believe they're better than the O'Driscolls, that their crimes are more justified or less harmful, but the reality is that both gangs cause tremendous harm regardless of their stated principles or justifications. Colm's intelligence is demonstrated not just in his elaborate plans, but in his survival for decades as a major outlaw. Staying alive and free as a notorious criminal in the late 19th century required intelligence, caution, and adaptability. Colm had to avoid law enforcement, manage a large criminal organisation, compete with rival gangs, and navigate the complex social and political landscape of the American West. His success in doing this for decades shows that he was smart, capable, and adaptable, not just a brute who relied on violence alone. This intelligence makes Colm's eventual capture more significant. The law didn't catch Colm because he was stupid or careless. They caught him because law enforcement was becoming more organised and effective, because the West was being civilized, and the spaces where outlaws could hide were shrinking. Colm's capture represents the inevitable triumph of civilization over the frontier, showing that even the smartest and most capable outlaws couldn't escape forever. The world was changing in ways that made the outlaw lifestyle unsustainable, and Colm's capture and execution demonstrate this historical reality. The O'Driscoll gang's recruitment of desperate men without much discrimination created a large organisation, but one without much quality or cohesion. Many O'Driscoll gang members were probably incompetent or unreliable, joining the gang because they had no better options rather than because they were skilled criminals. This meant the gang had numbers but lacked the skill and coordination of smaller, more selective organisations like the Van der Linde gang. The O'Driscolls could mobilise dozens of men for large operations, but those men weren't necessarily very good at what they did. This quantity over quality approach had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was that the gang could absorb losses easily, replacing killed or arrested members with new recruits without much difficulty. The disadvantage was that the gang's operations were often sloppy and attracted law enforcement attention, and the gang members' lack of loyalty meant they couldn't be trusted in difficult situations. The O'Driscolls were dangerous because of their numbers and their willingness to use violence, but they weren't particularly skilled or effective compared to more selective criminal organisations. The Van der Linde gang's more selective recruitment created a smaller but more skilled and cohesive organisation. Gang members were chosen for their abilities and their potential to fit into the gang's culture, and they were trained and mentored by more experienced members. This created a gang that was more effective and coordinated, capable of pulling off complex operations that required skill and teamwork. But it also meant the gang couldn't easily replace losses, and the death or departure of key members significantly weakened the organisation. Colm's cold pragmatism is both his strength and his limitation as a leader. His willingness to make decisions based on calculation rather than emotion means his decisions are generally rational and effective. He doesn't let pride or anger cloud his judgment, doesn't make emotional mistakes that compromise his goals. This makes him a more stable and predictable leader than Dutch, whose decisions are increasingly driven by ego and paranoia. But Colm's lack of emotional connection to his gang members also means he can't inspire genuine loyalty or create the kind of cohesive organisation that Dutch builds. This difference reflects different leadership philosophies and different approaches to building criminal organisations. Colm's approach is more businesslike and transactional, treating the gang as a business and gang members as employees. Dutch's approach is more personal and emotional, treating the gang as a family and gang members as loved ones. Both approaches have strengths and weaknesses, and neither ultimately prevents the gang's eventual destruction. The question of which approach is better doesn't have a clear answer, as both lead to similar outcomes in the end. The feud between Colm and Dutch is ultimately a waste, a pointless conflict that cost both gangs dearly without benefiting either. The feud started with betrayal and death, and it continued for 15 years, consuming resources and attention that could have been used for more productive purposes. Neither gang benefited from the conflict. Both would have been better off if they'd found a way to end the feud or simply avoid each other. But pride and revenge made peace impossible, and the feud continued until Colm's death, leaving both gangs weaker and more vulnerable. This futility is emphasized by the fact that Colm's death doesn't end the Van der Linde gang's problems or improve their situation. The gang continues to face mounting pressure from law, enforcement. Internal conflicts continue to tear the gang apart, and Dutch's judgment continues to deteriorate. The O'Driscolls were never the real threat to the Van der Linde gang. The real threats were internal dysfunction and the historical forces that were eliminating the outlaw way of life. The feud with Colm was a distraction from these real problems, a way for Dutch to focus on an external enemy rather than confronting the gang's actual issues. Colm's role as Dutch's dark mirror is one of his most important narrative functions. Colm shows what Dutch could become if he abandoned his principles entirely, if he stopped pretending to have ideals and just embraced being a criminal without justification. Throughout the game, Dutch gradually becomes more like Colm, more willing to sacrifice his people, more focused on his own survival and ego, more ruthless and less principled. The difference between Dutch and Colm narrows as the story progresses, showing Dutch's moral decline and his transformation into the kind of villain he claims to oppose. This transformation is tragic because it shows Dutch losing or abandoning the qualities that made him different from criminals like Colm. Dutch's philosophy and his emphasis on loyalty and family were what made the Van der Linde gang special, what made gang members willing to follow him and sacrifice for each other. As Dutch abandons these principles and becomes more like Colm, he loses the loyalty and cohesion that made his gang strong. By the end of the game, Dutch has become almost indistinguishable from Colm in his willingness to sacrifice others for his own interests, and the gang has collapsed as a result. The question of whether Dutch was always like Colm beneath the philosophical pretensions, or whether Dutch genuinely changed and fell from grace, is central to understanding Dutch's character. The game supports both interpretations, showing Dutch making increasingly bad decisions and abandoning his principles, while also suggesting that Dutch may have always been this way and just hid it better in the past. Colm serves as a reference point for this question, representing what Dutch becomes or what Dutch always was. The ambiguity is probably intentional, leaving players to decide for themselves whether Dutch is a tragic figure who lost his way, or a hypocrite who was never as good as he pretended to be. Colm's execution scene is brief but powerful, capturing the end of a notorious outlaw and the triumph of law over lawlessness. The scene is both satisfying, as a villain gets what he deserves, and disturbing, as a human being is killed as public entertainment. The game doesn't tell players how to feel about the execution, instead presenting it as a complex moment that can be interpreted in multiple ways. Some players probably feel satisfaction at seeing Colm die, while others might feel uncomfortable with the spectacle regardless of Colm's crimes. This ambiguity is characteristic of Red Dead, Redemption 2's approach to moral questions. The crowd at the execution represents the broader public's relationship with outlaws and outlaw culture. Outlaws were both feared and admired in the late 19th century, seen as both threats to order and as symbols of freedom and resistance. Public executions of notorious outlaws were major events that drew crowds because they represented the triumph of law over lawlessness, but also because they were the end of stories that people had followed with fascination. The crowd at Colm's execution is excited and nervous, eager to see the notorious outlaw hang, but also uncomfortable with the spectacle of death. Dutch's expression as he watches Colm die reveals the complexity of his feelings about his enemy. There's satisfaction there, the vindication Dutch came for, but there's also something darker and more complicated. Dutch has defined himself partly through his opposition to Colm, has used Colm as justification for his actions and as explanation for his failures. Colm's death should be liberating, but instead it seems to leave Dutch somewhat lost, deprived of the enemy who gave his violence meaning. This suggests that Dutch needs enemies and conflict to define himself, that without external threats to fight against, Dutch struggles to maintain his identity and purpose. Sadie's emotional response to the execution shows that revenge doesn't bring the closure or satisfaction people expect. Sadie wanted Colm dead because the O'Driscolls destroyed her life, and she hoped his death would bring justice or peace, or some sense that her husband's murder had been avenged. But watching Colm hang doesn't bring these things, it just reminds Sadie that her husband is still dead, and that no amount of revenge will change that. This realization is painful and realistic, showing that violence and revenge don't heal trauma or undo harm. they just perpetuate cycles of pain without leading anywhere good. The chaos that follows the execution, with the gang being recognised and chased through St. Denis, shows how Dutch's emotional decisions consistently lead to disasters. Dutch insisted on attending the execution despite the risks, driven by his need to see Colm die and to feel that he'd won their decades-long conflict. This emotional decision, this inability to let go and move on, directly leads to increased law enforcement attention and contributes to the gang's mounting problems. If Dutch had stayed away, if he'd let Colm die without needing to witness it, the gang would have been better off. But Dutch's ego and his need for vindication override his judgment, leading to yet another disaster. This pattern of emotional decision-making leading to disasters is repeated throughout Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch consistently makes decisions based on ego, pride, and emotion rather than rational assessment of risks and benefits. He insists on big scores when the gang should be lying low. He escalates conflicts when he should be de-escalating. He trusts the wrong people and doubts the right people based on who tells him what he wants to hear. These emotional decisions consistently make the gang situation worse, contributing to the mounting pressure and internal conflicts that eventually destroy the gang. Colm, by contrast, makes decisions based on calculation rather than emotion. He doesn't let pride or anger cloud his judgment, doesn't escalate conflicts unnecessarily, doesn't take unnecessary risks for emotional satisfaction. This makes Colm a more rational and effective leader than Dutch in many ways, even though Colm lacks Dutch's charisma and ability to inspire loyalty. Colm's eventual capture isn't due to emotional mistakes or poor judgment. It's due to the historical forces that were eliminating the outlaw way of life, regardless of individual outlaws' skills or decisions. The O'Driscoll gang's fragmentation after Colm's death shows the weakness of organisations built purely on fear and profit rather than genuine loyalty. Without Colm's leadership and reputation, the gang has no reason to stay unified. Gang members scatter or fight among themselves, pursuing their own interests rather than trying to maintain the organisation. This rapid collapse contrasts with the Van der Linde gang's slower, more painful disintegration, showing the difference between organisations built on transactional relationships versus those built on emotional bonds. The Van der Linde gang's collapse is more drawn out and more painful because the emotional bonds between members make betrayal and conflict more damaging. Gang members don't just leave when things get difficult. They fight and argue and try to hold things together because they genuinely care about each other and about the gang. This loyalty prolongs the gang's existence, but also makes its eventual collapse more traumatic and destructive. Former friends and family members turn on each other. Relationships that took years to build are destroyed in moments, and the gang tears itself apart from within rather than simply fragmenting. Colm's legacy is one of violence and fear without any positive impact or redeeming qualities. He built a large criminal organisation that hurt countless people and contributed nothing positive to the world. When he died, few if any mourned his passing, and his gang quickly collapsed without his leadership. Colm is remembered, if he's remembered at all, as one of many outlaw leaders who plagued the West during its final lawless years, as an example of the violence and chaos that civilization eventually eliminated. His life's work amounted to nothing but pain and suffering, leaving no lasting positive impact. This contrasts with Arthur's legacy, which is more complicated and more positive. Arthur also committed terrible crimes and hurt many people, but he also helped people, showed mercy and kindness, and ultimately sacrificed himself to ensure others could have better lives. Arthur's redemption arc shows that even people who've done terrible things can become better and can leave positive legacies through their final actions. Colm never attempts redemption, never shows any desire to be better or any recognition that his actions are wrong, so he dies as he lived, as a criminal who hurt people for profit. The question of whether Colm could have been redeemed if he'd wanted to be is interesting, but ultimately unanswerable. The game suggests that redemption is possible for people who genuinely want to change and who take actions to demonstrate that change. But Colm never shows any desire to change or any recognition that change is needed. Whether this is because Colm is incapable of change or because he simply chooses not to change is unclear, but the result is the same. Colm dies unredeemed, having never tried to be anything other than what he was. The historical context of Colm's story, the transition from frontier to civilization in the late 19th century, is crucial for understanding his character and his fate. Colm represents a way of life that's ending, a type of person who thrived in the lawless frontier but who can't survive in the modern civilized world that's emerging. The West is being settled and organized. Law enforcement is becoming more effective. Technology is making it harder for outlaws to hide and escape. Colm's capture and execution represent the inevitable triumph of civilization over the frontier, showing that the outlaw way of life is unsustainable in the face of historical change. This historical inevitability is a major theme in Red Dead Redemption 2. The game shows outlaws fighting against the forces of civilization and modernization, but it's clear from the beginning that they're fighting a losing battle. The frontier is disappearing, the spaces where outlaws could operate are shrinking, and law enforcement is becoming too organized and effective to evade indefinitely. Colm's death is part of this broader pattern, showing that even the most successful and capable outlaws can't escape the historical forces that are eliminating their way of life. The game's treatment of this historical transition is ambiguous, showing both the costs of outlaw violence and the costs of civilization's advance. Outlaws like Colm cause tremendous harm, victimizing innocent people and creating chaos and fear. Their elimination by law enforcement represents justice and progress, making communities safer and more stable. But civilization's advance also involves displacement of Native Americans, exploitation of workers, environmental destruction, and the loss of freedom and wildness that characterize the frontier. The game doesn't present a clear judgment about whether civilization's triumph over the frontier is good or bad, instead showing the complexity and the costs on all sides. Colm's Irish heritage connects him to broader patterns of immigrant experience in 19th century America. Irish immigrants face discrimination and hardship, often pushed into poverty and criminality by lack of legitimate opportunities. Irish gangs provided community, protection, and economic opportunities for people who were excluded from mainstream society. But these gangs also perpetuated cycles of violence and criminality, trapping people in outlaw lives that often ended badly. Colm's story is part of this broader pattern, showing both how discrimination can push people toward crime and how crime ultimately destroys those who practice it. The game's treatment of Irish characters is generally nuanced and respectful, showing them as complex people facing real challenges, while also showing that hardship doesn't excuse cruelty or violence. Colm is Irish, but his Irishness doesn't excuse his actions or make him sympathetic. He's a villain because of his choices, not because of his heritage. Other Irish characters in the game, like Sean Maguire, show that being Irish and being an outlaw doesn't necessarily mean being cruel or evil. The game avoids stereotyping while still acknowledging the historical reality of Irish immigrant criminality. Colm's relationship with Dutch is the defining relationship of both men's lives, shaping their decisions and their identities for over 15 years. The feud between them consumed resources and attention, cost both gangs members and opportunities, and ultimately benefited neither. The feud was personal and emotional, driven by revenge and pride rather than rational calculation of interests. This made it particularly destructive and particularly difficult to end, as neither man could let go of his hatred and his need for vindication. The origins of the feud, with Colm killing Annabelle and Dutch killing Colm's brother, show how violence begets violence, and how revenge creates cycles that are difficult to break. Each act of violence was retaliation for a previous act, and each created justification for further retaliation. Neither man could step back and recognize that continuing the feud was hurting both of them, that revenge wasn't bringing back their lost loved ones or making anything better. The feud continued until Colm's death, and even then it didn't bring Dutch the satisfaction or closure he sought. This futility of revenge is a major theme in Red Dead Redemption 2, shown through multiple characters and storylines. Revenge doesn't heal wounds or undo harm, it just perpetuates cycles of violence without leading anywhere good. Characters who pursue revenge, like Dutch and Sadie, find that it doesn't bring the satisfaction or closure they expected. The game suggests that letting go and moving forward is healthier than pursuing revenge, but it also shows how difficult letting go can be, especially when the wounds are deep and the losses are profound. Colm's death represents closure for the feud, but not resolution of the underlying issues that made the feud destructive. Dutch's problems continue after Colm dies, the gang's internal conflicts continue, and Dutch's judgment continues to deteriorate. The O'Driscolls were never the real problem. They were just a symptom or a distraction from the real problems of internal dysfunction and historical forces that were eliminating the outlaw way of life. Colm's death removes one external threat but doesn't address the internal and historical threats that ultimately destroy the Van der Linde gang. The O'Driscoll gang's crimes throughout the game establish them as villains who deserve the violence directed at them. The game is careful to show the O'Driscolls victimizing innocent people, killing families, torturing prisoners, and generally being cruel and evil. This makes the player's violence against the O'Driscolls feel justified and even heroic, as the player is eliminating dangerous criminals who've done terrible things. This is a common narrative technique in video games and other media, establishing enemies as deserving targets so that violence against them doesn't create moral discomfort. However, this technique also involves a degree of dehumanization, treating O'Driscoll gang members as acceptable targets rather than as people with their own stories and motivations. The game doesn't explore why individual O'Driscolls joined the gang, what circumstances led them to outlaw life, or whether they have families or people who care about them. They're presented as generic enemies to be killed without moral complexity or consideration. This is understandable from a gameplay perspective, but it also simplifies the moral reality of violence in ways that contrast with the game's more nuanced treatment of the Van der Linde gang. Colm's intelligence and strategic thinking are demonstrated throughout his appearances, showing that he's not just a brute, but a capable leader and planner. His plan to use Arthur as bait is clever and well thought out. His decision not to escalate to all-out war with Dutch shows strategic restraint, and his ability to maintain a large criminal organisation for decades shows organisational skill. These qualities make Colm a more interesting and threatening villain than he would be if he were just violent and stupid. He's someone who can match Dutch intellectually and strategically, making their conflict more interesting and more dangerous. This intelligence also makes Colm's eventual capture more significant. The law didn't catch Colm because he was careless or stupid. They caught him because they were becoming more organised and effective, because the spaces where outlaws could hide were shrinking, and because historical forces were making the outlaw lifestyle unsustainable. Colm's capture represents the triumph of systematic law enforcement over individual criminal capability, showing that even smart and capable outlaws couldn't escape forever in the face of civilization's advance. The O'Driscoll gang's size and reach show that Colm was successful in building a significant criminal empire. The gang operates across multiple states, has numerous hideouts, and can mobilize dozens of men for large operations. This level of organization and resources suggests that Colm was very effective at what he did, that he was a successful criminal leader who built and maintained a large organization in a competitive and dangerous environment. This success makes Colm a more significant figure and makes his eventual capture and execution more meaningful as a demonstration of law enforcement's increasing effectiveness. The gang's size also creates challenges for Colm in terms of management and control. A large organisation is harder to manage than a small one, requiring more coordination and creating more opportunities for betrayal or incompetence. Colm's transactional approach to leadership, treating gang members as interchangeable resources rather than building genuine loyalty, probably made managing a large organisation easier in some ways, but also made the organisation more fragile and dependent on his continued presence and success. Colm's cold pragmatism is both admirable and disturbing. It's admirable in that he makes rational decisions based on calculation, rather than letting emotion cloud his judgment. He doesn't make the kind of emotional mistakes that Dutch increasingly makes, doesn't let pride or anger lead him into bad decisions. But it's also disturbing because it reflects a complete lack of empathy or concern for others' welfare. Colm treats people as tools and resources, to be used and discarded as serves his interests, without any consideration for their humanity or suffering. This lack of empathy makes Colm effective as a criminal leader, but also makes him monstrous as a human being. He's capable of any cruelty if it serves his purposes, not because he enjoys cruelty, but because he simply doesn't care about others' suffering. This makes him more realistic and in some ways more disturbing than villains who are driven by sadism or madness. Colm is evil not because he's crazy, or because he enjoys hurting people, but because he's completely indifferent to others' pain, and willing to cause any amount of suffering if it benefits him. The contrast between Colm's pragmatism and Dutch's emotionalism shows different approaches to leadership and decision-making. Colm's approach is more rational and stable, leading to better decisions in many cases. But it also means Colm can't inspire genuine loyalty or create the kind of cohesive organisation that Dutch builds. Dutch's emotional approach creates genuine bonds and loyalty, but also leads to poor decisions when emotion overrides judgment. Neither approach is clearly superior, both have strengths and weaknesses, and both ultimately fail to prevent the gang's destruction. Colm's death by hanging is appropriate symbolically because it represents the law's triumph over lawlessness, the state's power to punish those who defy it. Public execution was a demonstration of state power, a way of showing that the law was stronger than any individual outlaw, and that defying the law would ultimately lead to death. Colm's execution serves this purpose, showing that even notorious and successful outlaws like Colm can be caught and punished, that the law is patient and persistent and will eventually catch everyone. The public nature of the execution also serves as moral instruction and deterrence, showing people the consequences of criminality and hopefully deterring them from following similar paths. Whether public executions actually deterred crime is debatable, but that was certainly part of their intended purpose. Colm's execution draws a large crowd of people who want to see the notorious outlaw hang, to witness the end of his story and the triumph of law over his criminality. The crowd's mixture of excitement and discomfort reflects the complicated relationship people had with public executions, seeing them as both justice and spectacle, both necessary and disturbing. Colm's final moments on the gallows show him facing death with a kind of dignity that's surprising given his cruelty and cowardice throughout his life. He doesn't beg or plead or break down. He faces his death with composure even though he's clearly afraid. Perhaps Colm recognizes that how he dies is the last thing he can control, the last statement he can make, and he chooses to die without giving his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him break. Or perhaps he's simply too proud or too stubborn to show weakness even in his final moments. Either way, his composure in the face of death is the closest thing to an admirable quality that Colm displays in the game. The moment when Colm's eyes find Dutch in the crowd is charged with meaning and history. These two men have been enemies for over 15 years, have cost each other dearly, have defined themselves partly through their opposition to each other. Now one is about to die while the other watches, and in that final moment, the entire history of their relationship is present. What passes between them in that look is ambiguous. Perhaps recognition, perhaps defiance, perhaps a kind of grim satisfaction that Colm is taking Dutch's obsession with him to the grave. The game doesn't explain what either man is thinking or feeling, leaving it to players to interpret based on what they know of the characters and their history. Dutch's reaction to Colm's death is complex and revealing. He should be satisfied, should feel that he's won their decades-long conflict, but instead he looks almost lost, almost sad, as if something important has been taken from him rather than given to him. This suggests that Dutch's identity has been so wrapped up in his conflict with Colm that Colm's death leaves Dutch without a crucial part of his self-definition. Dutch has spent 15 years hating Colm, using Colm as justification for his actions and as explanation for his failures. Without Colm, Dutch will need to find new justifications and new explanations, and increasingly those will come from within his own gang or from abstract enemies like civilization and progress. Sadie's reaction is more straightforward but equally revealing. She wanted Colm dead, hoped his death would bring closure or justice or peace, but watching him hang doesn't bring these things. It just reminds her that her husband is still dead and that revenge doesn't undo harm or heal trauma. This realization is painful and realistic, showing that the satisfaction of revenge is often empty, and that violence doesn't solve the problems it's supposed to solve. Sadie's emotional breakdown at the execution reflects this disappointment and disillusionment, showing her struggling with the reality that revenge hasn't brought her what she hoped for. The chaos that follows the execution shows how Dutch's emotional decisions consistently lead to disasters. Dutch insisted on attending despite the risks, driven by his need to see Colm die. Sadie's emotional breakdown draws attention to their group. Law enforcement recognizes Dutch, and suddenly they're running for their lives through St. Denis. This disaster was entirely avoidable if Dutch had stayed away, or if he'd been able to control Sadie's emotional response. They would have been fine. But Dutch's need for vindication and his inability to manage his people's emotions lead to yet another crisis that makes the gang situation worse. This pattern repeats throughout the game, with Dutch making emotional decisions that lead to disasters. He insists on big scores when the gang should be lying low. He escalates conflicts when he should be de-escalating. He trusts people who tell him what he wants to hear, and doubts people who tell him uncomfortable truths. These emotional decisions consistently make the gang situation worse, contributing to the mounting pressure and internal conflicts that eventually destroy the gang. Dutch's inability to control his emotions and make rational decisions is one of his greatest weaknesses as a leader, and it's a weakness that Colm doesn't share. Colm's pragmatic approach to decision-making means he generally makes better strategic choices than Dutch. He doesn't let pride or anger cloud his judgment, doesn't take unnecessary risks for emotional satisfaction, doesn't escalate conflicts unnecessarily. This makes Colm a more effective leader in many ways, even though he lacks Dutch's charisma and ability to inspire loyalty. Colm's eventual capture isn't due to poor judgment or emotional mistakes. It's due to historical forces that were eliminating the outlaw way of life regardless of individual capability or decision-making. The O'Driscoll gang's rapid fragmentation after Colm's death demonstrates the weakness of organizations built on fear and profit rather than genuine loyalty. Without Colm's leadership and reputation, the gang has no cohesion or reason to stay unified. Gang members scatter or fight among themselves, pursuing their own interests rather than trying to maintain the organization. This rapid collapse shows that the O'Driscoll gang was always fragile, held together only by Colm's presence and success. When those were removed, the gang simply ceased to exist as a meaningful organization. This contrasts sharply with the Van der Linde gang's slower, more painful disintegration. The Van der Linde gang is held together by emotional bonds and genuine loyalty, which means it doesn't simply fragment when things get difficult. Instead, it tears itself apart through internal conflict and betrayal, with former friends and family members turning on each other. The emotional bonds that made the gang strong also make its collapse more traumatic and destructive. The gang doesn't just scatter, it destroys itself from within, with relationships that took years to build being destroyed in moments. Colm O'Driscoll's story is ultimately about the futility of a life devoted to crime and violence. Colm spent decades building a criminal empire, surviving in a dangerous and competitive environment, becoming one of the West's most notorious outlaws. But all of that amounted to nothing in the end. He was captured and executed, his gang fragmented and disappeared, and his life's work left no positive legacy. He hurt countless people and contributed nothing positive to the world. His death was probably a relief to many people who'd been victimized by his gang, and few, if any, mourned his passing. This futility is emphasized by the fact that Colm's death doesn't even benefit his enemies. Dutch and Sadie wanted Colm dead, but his death doesn't bring them satisfaction or solve their problems. The Van der Linde gang situation continues to deteriorate after Colm's execution, and Dutch's obsession with witnessing the execution actually makes things worse. The feud between Colm and Dutch consumed both men's lives for 15 years, cost both gangs dearly, and ultimately benefited neither. It was a waste, a pointless conflict driven by pride and revenge that led nowhere good. The game's treatment of Colm as a villain is effective but somewhat one-dimensional. Colm is presented as evil and cruel, without the complexity or sympathy that characters like Dutch or Arthur receive. This makes Colm an effective antagonist, and makes violence against him and his gang feel justified, but it also makes him less interesting as a character. Colm exists primarily to serve narrative functions, to create conflict and to serve as Dutch's dark mirror, rather than to be a fully realised person in his own right. This is a common limitation with villains in video games and other media. They're often less developed than protagonists because their primary purpose is to create conflict rather than to be interesting themselves. However, Colm is still more interesting than many video game villains because of his intelligence, his role as Dutch's mirror, and the historical context of his story. He's not just a generic bad guy, he's a specific type of villain, representing a particular approach to outlaw life and a particular historical moment. His conflict with Dutch raises interesting questions about morality, loyalty, and the difference between justified and unjustified violence. His eventual capture and execution represent broader historical forces and the end of an era. These elements make Colm more than just an obstacle for the player to overcome. They make him part of the game's broader themes and historical narrative. Colm's Irish heritage and the historical context of Irish immigrant criminality add depth to his character and connect him to broader social and historical patterns. Irish gangs were common in 19th century America, formed partly as a response to discrimination and lack of legitimate opportunities. These gangs provided community and economic opportunity for people who were excluded from mainstream society, but they also perpetuated cycles of violence and criminality. Colm's story is part of this broader pattern, showing both how social conditions can push people toward crime and how crime ultimately destroys those who practice it. The game's treatment of this historical context is subtle and respectful, acknowledging the reality of Irish immigrant criminality without stereotyping or excusing it. Colm is Irish, but his Irishness doesn't excuse his actions or make him sympathetic. He's a villain because of his choices, not because of his heritage or circumstances. Other Irish characters in the game show that being Irish doesn't determine character or destiny, but people make choices regardless of their background. This nuanced treatment avoids stereotyping while still acknowledging historical realities. The relationship between Colm and his brother, whose death at Dutch's hands helped fuel the feud, remains mysterious throughout the game. We don't know the brother's name, his role in the gang, or the exact circumstances of his death. We don't know if Colm genuinely loved his brother, or if the brother's death was more about the insult and challenge to Colm's authority. This ambiguity makes Colm harder to read and understand, makes it difficult to know if his motivations are personal or purely strategic. The game leaves this deliberately unclear, maintaining Colm's mystique and making him more difficult to sympathise with. This lack of sympathetic detail is probably intentional, as the game wants Colm to serve as a villain rather than as a complex sympathetic character, giving Colm too much depth. or showing him grieving for his brother might make him too sympathetic, might create moral complexity that would interfere with the player's willingness to fight against him and his gang. By keeping Colm somewhat mysterious and one-dimensional, the game maintains him as an acceptable target for violence without creating uncomfortable moral questions. Colm's plan to use Arthur as bait to capture Dutch is the most elaborate and revealing of his schemes in the game. The plan shows Colm's intelligence and strategic thinking, his understanding of Dutch's psychology, and his willingness to be patient and elaborate in pursuing his goals. The plan also shows Colm's cruelty and his willingness to use people as tools without concern for their suffering. Arthur is tortured and held in terrible conditions not because it's necessary for the plan, but because Colm simply doesn't care about Arthur's welfare. This casual cruelty, this complete indifference to others' suffering is what makes Colm truly evil rather than just criminal. The plan's failure due to Arthur's escape shows that even well-designed plans can fail due to variables that can't be controlled. Colm correctly assessed Dutch's psychology and created a clever trap, but he underestimated Arthur's resourcefulness and determination. This shows that Colm, for all his intelligence and planning, isn't infallible. He makes mistakes and fails to account for all variables just like everyone else. His eventual capture by law enforcement is probably due to similar factors. A well-designed plan by law enforcement combined with variables that Colm couldn't control or predict. Arthur's torture at O'Driscoll hands is one of the game's most brutal and disturbing sequences, establishing the O'Driscolls as genuinely evil rather than just criminal. The torture goes beyond what's necessary to keep Arthur prisoner, showing that the O'Driscolls take pleasure in causing pain, or at least don't care about causing unnecessary suffering. This cruelty makes the O'Driscolls hateable, and makes later violence against them feel justified and even satisfying. The game is careful to establish the O'Driscolls as deserving targets before having the player kill dozens of them in raids and missions. Arthur's escape from captivity is a testament to his toughness and resourcefulness, showing that he's capable of surviving and fighting even when badly injured and outnumbered. The escape also shows Arthur's determination to get back to the gang and warn them about Colm's plan, demonstrating Arthur's loyalty even as he's starting to question Dutch's leadership. The escape sequence is tense and memorable, one of the game's standout moments that shows Arthur at his most vulnerable and most determined. Dutch's failure to rescue Arthur, whether due to genuine confusion or calculated decision that rescue was too risky, is a crucial turning point in Arthur's relationship with Dutch. Arthur has always trusted that Dutch would protect him and the other gang members, that Dutch's talk of loyalty and family was genuine. Dutch's failure to come for Arthur plants seeds of doubt that will grow throughout the rest of the game, contributing to Arthur's eventual break with Dutch, and his decision to prioritise John's survival over loyalty to Dutch's plans. The ambiguity about whether Dutch knew Arthur was captured is important, because it affects how we interpret Dutch's character and his arc. If Dutch knew and chose not to rescue Arthur, it shows Dutch is already far gone, already willing to sacrifice his most loyal lieutenant to avoid risk. If Dutch genuinely didn't realise Arthur was in danger, it shows Dutch is becoming dangerously disconnected from his gang, so focused on his own concerns that he's not paying attention to his people's welfare. Either interpretation is damning, showing Dutch's failure as a leader and as the father figure he claims to be to his gang members. Colm's execution represents the end of an era in multiple ways. It's the end of the feud between Colm and Dutch that shaped both men's lives for over 15 years. It's the end of the O'Driscoll gang as a significant criminal organisation. It's a demonstration of law enforcement's increasing effectiveness in hunting down and eliminating major outlaws. And it's a symbol of the West's transition from frontier to civilization, from a place where outlaws could thrive to a place where law and order prevail. Colm's death is both a personal story about one man's end and a historical moment representing broader social changes. The fact that Colm's death doesn't bring closure or satisfaction to those who wanted him dead shows the futility of revenge and the emptiness of violence as a solution to problems. Dutch and Sadie both wanted Colm dead, believed his death would bring them peace, or justice, or vindication. But Colm's death changes nothing meaningful for either of them. Their problems continue, their pain remains, and they're left feeling empty rather than satisfied. This is a recurring theme in Red Dead Redemption 2, that violence doesn't solve problems and revenge doesn't heal wounds, that the cycle of violence just perpetuates itself without leading anywhere good. The O'Driscoll gang's crimes throughout the game establish them as indiscriminate predators who victimize anyone vulnerable. They rob homesteads and kill families, ambush travellers and leave no witnesses, rustle cattle and destroy livelihoods, work as hired guns for corrupt interests. This variety of criminal activity shows the O'Driscolls as opportunistic and adaptable, willing to do whatever is profitable regardless of the harm caused. This indiscriminate approach to crime is what separates the O'Driscolls from the Van der Linde gang in the game's moral framework, even though the Van der Linde gang also commits terrible acts. The game's treatment of the O'Driscolls as acceptable targets for violence involves a degree of dehumanization, treating O'Driscoll gang members as enemies to be killed, rather than as people with their own stories and motivations. This is understandable from a gameplay perspective. The game needs enemies for players to fight, and making those enemies too sympathetic would create uncomfortable moral questions. But it's also a simplification that contrasts with the game's more nuanced treatment of the Van der Linde gang and their victims. The O'Driscolls are presented as generic villains rather than as complex people, which makes violence against them feel acceptable but also less morally complex. Colm's intelligence and capability are demonstrated throughout his appearances, showing that he's a formidable opponent who can match Dutch strategically and intellectually. His plan to use Arthur as bait is clever. His decision not to escalate to all-out war shows strategic restraint, and his ability to maintain a large criminal organisation for decades shows organisational skill. These qualities make Colm a more interesting and threatening villain than he would be if he were just violent and stupid. He's someone who poses a genuine threat to Dutch and the Van der Linde gang, someone who can't be easily dismissed or defeated. This capability makes Colm's eventual capture more significant. The law didn't catch Colm because he was careless or incompetent. They caught him because they were becoming more organised and effective, because the spaces where outlaws could hide were shrinking, and because historical forces were making the outlaw lifestyle unsustainable. Colm's capture represents the triumph of systematic law enforcement over individual criminal capability, showing that even smart and capable outlaws couldn't escape forever in the face of civilization's advance. The O'Driscoll gang's size and reach demonstrate Colm's success in building a significant criminal empire. The gang operates across multiple states, has numerous hideouts, and can mobilize dozens of men for large operations. This level of organization and resources shows that Colm was very effective at what he did, that he was a successful criminal leader who built and maintained a large organization in a competitive and dangerous environment. This success makes Colm a more significant figure and makes his eventual capture and execution more meaningful as a demonstration of law enforcement's increasing effectiveness. Colm's cold pragmatism is both his strength and his limitation. His willingness to make decisions based on calculation rather than emotion means his decisions are generally rational and effective. He doesn't let pride or anger cloud his judgment, doesn't make emotional mistakes that compromise his goals. This makes him a more stable and predictable leader than Dutch, whose decisions are increasingly driven by ego and paranoia. But Colm's lack of emotional connection to his gang members also means he can't inspire genuine loyalty or create the kind of cohesive organisation that Dutch builds. The contrast between Colm's pragmatism and Dutch's emotionalism shows different approaches to leadership and different philosophies about how to build and maintain criminal organisations. Colm's approach is more businesslike and transactional, treating the gang as a business and gang members as employees. Dutch's approach is more personal and emotional, treating the gang as a family and gang members as loved ones. Both approaches have strengths and weaknesses, and neither ultimately prevents the gang's eventual destruction. The question of which approach is better doesn't have a clear answer, as both lead to similar outcomes in the end. Colm's death by hanging is symbolically appropriate because it represents the law's triumph over lawlessness, the state's power to punish those who defy it. Public execution was a demonstration of state power, a way of showing that the law was stronger than any individual outlaw, and that defying the law would ultimately lead to death. Colm's execution serves this purpose, showing that even notorious and successful outlaws can be caught as punished, that the law is patient and persistent, and will eventually catch everyone who breaks it. The public nature of the execution also serves as moral instruction and deterrence, showing people the consequences of criminality and hopefully deterring them from following similar paths. Whether public executions actually deterred crime is debatable, but that was certainly part of their intended purpose. Colm's execution draws a large crowd of people who want to see the notorious outlaw hang, to witness the end of his story and the triumph of law over his criminality. The crowd's mixture of excitement and discomfort reflects the complicated relationship people had with public executions, seeing them as both justice and spectacle, both necessary and disturbing. Colm's final moments show him facing death with composure despite his obvious fear. He doesn't beg or plead or break down. He faces his death with a kind of dignity that's surprising given his cruelty throughout his life. Perhaps Colm recognises that how he dies is the last thing he can control, the last statement he can make, and he chooses to die without giving his enemies the satisfaction of seeing him break. Or perhaps he's simply too proud or too stubborn to show weakness even in his final moments. Either way, his composure in the face of death is the closest thing to an admirable quality that Colm displays in the game. The moment when Colm's eyes find Dutch in the crowd is charged with meaning and history. These two men have been enemies for over 15 years, have cost each other dearly, have defined themselves partly through their opposition to each other. Now one is about to die while the other watches, and in that final moment the entire history of their relationship is present. What passes between them in that look is ambiguous and open to interpretation. Perhaps it's recognition, perhaps defiance, perhaps a kind of grim satisfaction that Colm is taking Dutch's obsession with him to the grave. The game doesn't explain what either man is thinking or feeling, leaving it to players to interpret based on what they know of the characters and their history. Colm O'Driscoll's story in Red Dead Redemption 2 is ultimately about the futility of a life devoted to crime and violence, about the inevitable triumph of law over lawlessness, and about the costs of revenge and hatred. Colm spent decades building a criminal empire, becoming one of the West's most notorious outlaws, surviving in a dangerous and competitive environment. But all of that amounted to nothing in the end. He was captured and executed, his gang fragmented and disappeared, and his life's work left no positive legacy. He hurt countless people and contributed nothing positive to the world. His death doesn't even benefit his enemies, as Dutch and Sadie discover that revenge doesn't bring the satisfaction or closure they expected. The feud between Colm and Dutch consumed both men's lives for 15 years, cost both gangs dearly, and ultimately benefited neither. It was a waste, a pointless conflict driven by pride and revenge that led nowhere good. Colm's story serves as a cautionary tale about the costs of violence and the futility of revenge, showing that the cycle of violence perpetuates itself without leading to anything positive. Colm also serves as Dutch's dark mirror, showing what Dutch could become if he abandoned his principle entirely. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, Dutch gradually becomes more like Colm, more willing to sacrifice his people, more focused on his own survival and ego, more ruthless and less principled. The difference between Dutch and Colm narrows as the story progresses, showing Dutch's moral decline and his transformation into the kind of villain he claims to oppose. This transformation is tragic because it shows Dutch losing or abandoning the qualities that made him different from criminals like Colm. In the end, Colm O'Driscoll is remembered, if he's remembered at all, as one of many outlaw leaders who plagued the West during its final lawless years, as an example of the violence and chaos that civilization eventually eliminated. His life's work amounted to nothing but pain and suffering, leaving no lasting positive impact. He was intelligent and capable, qualities that would have been used for better purposes, but he chose to use those qualities for crime and cruelty. His death was probably a relief to many people who'd been victimized by his gang, and few if any mourned his passing. His story is a tragedy, but not a sympathetic one. It's the tragedy of a wasted life that hurt others and accomplished nothing of value.